Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to thank Senator Bozeman for his courtesy. Mr. Rosenstein, welcome.
Thank you.
Mr. Rosenstein, thank you. I remember.
Just like Feinstein.
I remember that. That's easy for me to remember. We work together all the time. I'm going to ask you about something a little different, maybe refreshing for you. Probably not at the top of your agenda, but I hope it'll be on your agenda as time goes on. Outdated federal consent decrees, and specifically how such things affect songwriters in Nashville. Outdated federal consent decrees. In 2006, I introduced legislation based upon a book called Democracy by Decree, What Happens When Courts Run Government. It was by Professors Sandler and Schoenbrod, who were attorneys for the National Resources Defense Council. It was about the growing number of federal consent decrees that seemed to manage everything. A lot of it had to do with education, some with the environment, some with clean air litigation, variety of other things, and it took these issues out of the hands of legislators, and courts were running the government. So in general, the legislation would have allowed newly elected governors, mayors, and legislators to file motions to vacate the consent decrees and put those issues back out in the democratic process. Let me talk about one example of that. It has to do with songwriters. Might not seem very important in Washington, D.C., but we have thousands of them in Nashville. It's the center of songwriting. Most of them are waiters and bus drivers and teachers in the meantime, hoping to make a big hit. 75 years ago, the Justice Department noticed some antitrust implications on the two organizations that regulates how songwriters are paid for their work. Let me give you an example. A few years ago, I was with some songwriters, and I had gone outside a pharmacy, and I saw an old couple there, and I said, "How you all doing?" And the lady said, "We're just falling apart together." So I mentioned that to the songwriters, Lee Brice and Billy Montana and another songwriter. They said, "I think we could do something with that." And they wrote a song called Falling Apart Together. Lee Brice put it on one of his albums, and I get a fourth of the royalties for that because that's the way Nashville works. If the four of us write a song, we each split it up. Last year, I got $110 for my royalty, even though it's on Lee Brice's album, and he's a pretty well-known singer. That's the first problem. Under the consent decree that's 75 years old, you've got a rate court that sets what the songwriters get paid. It doesn't reflect the market value. The second is more immediate. Your department issues regulations and interpretations of regulations based upon the consent decrees. One recent regulation said that if Lee Brice and I and Billy Montana and another writer are sitting around writing, that we have to check and see who represents us, and that any one of us can go out and find that person and make a deal with a bar or a restaurant that affects all the others of us. And it would turn the common, ordinary, everyday practice of songwriting in Nashville upside down. And I'm not surprised that someone in the Department of Justice wouldn't know that you co-write songs. You just sit down informally. You might spend a weekend, write 6 songs. But what this would do is just tear that all apart, cause these songwriters, not wealthy people, to have to consult lawyers, make agreements, do all this kind of thing. The songwriters have appealed the Justice Department interpretation. The court, federal district court, agreed with that. Now you're appealing it further to a higher court. So my request of you is not for you to answer me today on how to solve that problem, but one, would you put on your agenda somewhere the general issue of democracy by decree, outdated federal consent decrees, and consider whether it's not time to give governors and mayors and legislators an opportunity to file motions to vacate those consent decrees and get them back in the hands of the democratic process. And second, will you consider the Department of Justice interpretation that's now an appeal to a federal district court that if you're successful, will turn the everyday business of songwriting in Nashville upside down? I'm sure it's not what's intended by the Department of Justice, but that would be the practical effect.
Senator, I happen to be a country music fan. It's something I passed on to my daughter, so I'm tempted to comment. But
it's all right with me if you do.
As you recognize, there is pending litigation, and I'm not I'm not at liberty to comment on the pending litigation. But I do want to comment on the general issue with regard to consent decrees. I think there are some questions that we should ask with regard to proposed consent decrees. Will it help solve a problem? How do we evaluate success? How do we know if it's working? How much is it going to cost, and when will it end? I think those are appropriate questions to the extent that we are considering imposing consent decrees. And as I'm sure you recognize, a consent decree is consent between the parties, and so there are always opportunities to revisit if there's agreement among the parties. If there's not, then there may be litigation, as you mentioned. But I regret I don't have any opinion to offer on the proposed legislation, but I can assure you that we will, when there are consent decree issues in the department, we'll think very seriously about all those and other issues.
I thank you for your answer. And the consent decree under which the lawsuit and the rate court are established was put in place in 1941. That seems to me to be too long to keep something out of the hands of the democracy. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Senator Manchin.
Mr. Rosenstein, it's good to have you here.